Rosh Chodesh. So you would not date the Ksuva Aleph Rosh Chodesh Iyar. You would actually date the Ksuva Shloshim B'Nisan, and Aleph B'Iyar is tomorrow. The only exception to that pattern is Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is a 2-day Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, but the first day of Rosh Hashanah is Aleph Tishrei. That's the only case where that works. Every other 2-day Rosh Chodesh, the first day is the 30th of the last month. So, I suppose that's a little bit of a limud zechus for people who are not yet here, because, once again, second day Rosh Chodesh is the first of the month. Again, just to remind people, we are, Mir Hashem, towards the home stretch of the Talmud Devorah. As I said, I can make no claim that it is the best share on the internet, Talmud Devorah, but it is certainly the longest share, absolutely the longest. We have, Mir Hashem will have probably 90 sessions altogether. We're already up to 75, 76. So Mir Hashem, we have the last 2 pragim, and Be'ez Hashem, hopefully we will finish it, and then we'll go on to a new inyan. Rabbi Wiener suggested he wanted to actually something interesting. It's a very, he wanted us to go through Nevi'im and Kesuvim, go through Nach in kind of at least summary fashion, to cover kind of the main points, or at least to be familiar with Nach. We wouldn't be reading it pasuk by pasuk, but at least to kind of get an overview of the different topics. Again, I'm happy to hear people's input or people's feeling about it. This is what he suggested, and Hashem that'll be our next project after Talmud Devorah. I'm sorry, someone want to say something? Oh, yeah.
How are we gonna? What's the idea to go through Talmud Devorah? The kids are how are we making a heshbon on?
Oh, you want me to, after the 80 sessions, you want me to summarize? Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll devote a session to summary, again, because the summary can actually be very, very long. Somebody was telling me they go to a yeshiva where every few months they have a chazara of what they learned, which is very good. So I said, how long is the chazara? The chazara is 3 weeks. Now, 3 weeks of chazara, I don't know, it seems to me a little counterproductive, because I'm sure by the end of the 3rd week, you already don't remember what you did the first week, so so to have a long chazara would essentially be relearning the Sefer, but maybe hopefully we'll devote a short chazara to it. Okay, but for today, just by way of general orientation, I want to talk a little bit about Sfiras HaOmer, and you'll see that it will actually connect to the Talmud Devorah as well. First of all, we know obviously there's a mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. Hopefully nobody missed any days yet, and hopefully you won't miss any days coming up as well. So there's an interesting machlokas. The makor of Sfiras HaOmer is in the parsha of Parshas Emor, the parsha that we're going to read a week from Shabbos. And this is the pasuk that says, Usvartem lachem, you should start counting, mimacharas HaShabbos, from the day after Shabbos, we'll come back to that, from the day that you bring the Korban HaOmer, 7 complete weeks. So as you probably know, there was a huge machlokas between the Tzdukim. This was a movement during the second Beis HaMikdash that did not believe in the Torah Shebaal Peh, and the Prushim, the Pharisees, which are Chazal. What does the word Shabbos mean? The Tzdukim, who tended to read the Torah very, very literally, understood that Shabbos meant Saturday, and Mimacharas HaShabbos means Sunday, and they commenced the counting of the Omer, not from the second day of Pesach, they commenced it from the Sunday after Pesach. Every year, no matter what, the Sunday after Pesach was the first day of the Omer, and Shavuos would be the 50th day, because they interpreted Shabbos to mean Shabbos gracious, Saturday. Chazal had a very different view, that part of the Torah Shebaal Peh is that the reference to Shabbos in that pasuk does not mean Saturday, but Shabbos in that pasuk means the first day of Pesach, which is also called Shabbos because it's a day that you refrain from malacha, and therefore they interpreted Mimacharas HaShabbos not to mean Sunday, but they interpreted it to mean the second day of Pesach. I'll discuss later, so why does the Torah use the word Shabbos? Okay, that is a very, very good question. But still, this was a fundamental machlokas between the Tzdukim and the Prushim that lasted hundreds of years. And the Chachamim went to great pains to dispel or to refute the position of the Tzdukim. You may wonder, why did the position of the Tzdukim have any staying power? I mean, there were many positions of Tzdukim that were never accepted by large numbers of people. So why would it bedavka be this one that had so much traction? So it's interesting. Some want to suggest, it's a little mashram from Gemara this way, that because it's a very convenient position. Because keep in mind that Shavuos in Eretz Yisrael is only a one-day Yom Tov. There's no Chol HaMoed. So you only get one day off from work. But when you start counting the Omer on Sunday, Shavuos will always be on a Sunday. Right? You understand, the 50th day is always the same day of the week as day one, because 7 weeks, right? If you start on a Sunday, the 7 weeks are over on Shabbos. Shavuos is going to be on a Sunday. When Shavuos is on a Sunday, that's very attractive because that gives people 2 days off from their working schedule. It gives them Shabbos and it gives them Sunday. And as a result, because of the popularity of a 2-day vacation for Shavuos, many people gravitated to the position of the Tzdukim. The Gemara actually is mashma such a thing. In fact, one of the arguments that Tzdukim made was, it sounds frivolous, but they said, Moshe Rabbeinu was an Ohev Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu was a lover of the Jewish people. And therefore he wanted to give them the holiday of Shavuos that would always be adjacent to a Shabbos and the like. But be it as it may, this is the position of the Tzdukim. We totally reject it. Now, a little digression here, and I think I talked about this before. Do not confuse the Tzdukim with the Karaim. Tzdukim and Karaim are two different movements, although there is a lot of commonality between them. The Tzdukim were a movement that existed during the latter decades of the Bayit Sheni. And the Tzdukim were called Tzdukim simply because the founder of the movement was a man called Sadok. Another person was Baisus. So you find there Tzedukim and Baisusim. These were simply two movements, but they essentially had the same philosophy. And this was a denial of the Messiah of Torah Shebaal Peh. And again, it may not have been theological. It may have been for personal motives or whatever it was. But the truth of the matter is that Tzdukim at one point had a lot of influence. They tended to be the wealthier class. They tended to be politically well connected to the Romans and the like. So many of the aristocracy in Eretz Yisrael were Tzdukim. And indeed, there is actually an overlap between the Tzdukim and the Misyavnim. The Misyavnim, we know from the Hanukkah story, are the Jews who adopted Hellenistic culture. So it's interesting, although Hellenists and Sadducees are not necessarily going to be the same people, as a matter of fact, it often turned out that they were the same people. So the Tzdukim, the Baisusim, the Misyavnim, although they were technically distinct in some ways, were an overlapping population of people who did not accept the Messiah of Torah Shebaal Peh. Now, the Tzdukim, Baisusim, and the like, they basically were extinct by the Churban Bayis Sheni. They simply were. They did not survive as a movement. Were there individual Sadducees? Probably yes, but essentially all references to Tzdukim in Chazal are pre-Churban. The only real Judaism that survived the Churban is real Judaism, that of the Pharisees, that of the Prushim, that of the Messiah of Torah Shebaal Peh, as recorded in the Mishnah and later the discussions of the Gemara. Okay, so there were no Tzdukim after, or at least there was no movement of Tzdukim after the Churban Bayis Sheni. Now, the Karaim, or the Karaites, arose much, much, much later, and they are really, after the Gemara, they're in the time of the Gaonim, they're in the time of Rav Sadia Gaon. We even know who the inventor of Karaism was. It was a fellow, Anan ben David. Now, Anan ben David was not born a Karaite. He couldn't have been born a Karaite because he invented Karaites. He was born as a regular Jewish person. Presumably, he was at least somewhat halachically observant, perhaps even learned, and he wanted a certain political position in the Jewish community. The political position he wanted was that of Reish Galusa. Now, Reish Galusa is mentioned in the Gemara itself, but the Reish Galusa continued. Reish Galusa literally means the head of the diaspora, and this was essentially what you might call the political leader of the Jewish community in Babylonia, which in turn was the dominant Jewish community in the world, much more so than Eretz Israel, which had a very small Jewish community. Reish Galusa. Now, Reish Galusa is an old office. Reish Galusa existed in the time of Chazal, but it continued into the time of the Gaonim. So there were two basic heads. The spiritual leaders were called Gaon. Right? Gaon did not just mean great rabbi like we use it today, but Gaon was a title of leadership. Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Amram Gaon, Rav Shureira Gaon, many, many Gaonim. And these were the heads of certain yeshivos in Babylonia. There were two major yeshivos for most of the period of the Gaonim, the yeshiva of Sura and the yeshiva of Pumbedisa. That's why you often find the Rishonim will often refer to the minhag of the Shtei yeshivot. There were many other smaller yeshivas, but in terms of the dominant position of Gaon, that was Sura, Pumbedisa, and the like. So they were the spiritual leaders. Sura was a bit more dominant than Pumbedisa. The political leader was Reish Galusa. Sometimes the Reish Galusa were learned, sometimes they were not, but you can obviously imagine, just as you find in the Gemara itself, that there was sometimes antagonism between the Reish Galusa and the Gaonim. The Gaonim had certain halachic positions, and the Reish Galusa may not have liked it, etc. So sometimes there was a lot of animosity. We don't know as much as we would like to know about the period of the Gaonim, but it was a bit of a turbulent period in a lot of ways. Anyway, Anan ben David was in line to become Reish Galusa, and he didn't get the job. Someone else got the job, so he was very unhappy with it. So he went and he founded his own religion, his own movement, where he could be the boss, and that was the movement called Karaites, right? Karaim. Now Karaim, Karai is psukim. Now Karaim you might look at as a resuscitation of the old discarded philosophy of the Tzdukim. But it was a reincarnation of it. There's no historical continuity between Tzdukim and Karayim. Karayim Aro, right, the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, let's say, in the year 70. Anan ben David founded the Karaites around, in the 900s. So there was almost 1,000 years between the last Sadducees and the Karayim. But philosophically, Karayim did emphasize this idea that we don't accept Chazal. We don't accept the Gaonim, we don't accept the Talmud. Now, there were Karaites who learned Gemara, but a Karaite who learned Gemara would be like a Jewish scholar who read the New Testament, meaning academically they would learn, what the Talmud said, but they did not consider it to be authoritative. Now, Karaim, unlike Tzdukim, do exist to the present day. There are Karaim even today. There's a Karaite synagogue, a few Karaite synagogues in Eretz Israel. There's a Karaite chief rabbi, etc. In fact, in some ways, Karaim, they're not, it's different than Reform. Karaim are very frum, but they're frum in their way, which we consider to be totally improper. But they're very conscientious in the observances that they have. So, to this day, they will count the Omer, like the Tzdukim did, from a Sunday, and always have Shavuos on Sunday. And just to give you some other interesting examples of Karayim. Karayim do wear tzitzis, because after all, the mitzvah of tzitzis is pretty explicit in the written Torah. You should make fringes on your garments, so they do. So they wear a talit, and I'm not an expert in this, but their talit more or less, I believe, I've seen pictures, kind of looks like our talis. They don't wear tefillin. Why don't they wear tefillin? Because they understand that when the Torah says, you shall tie it as a sign on your arm and as an adornment between your eyes, they understand it symbolically. You should pledge your strength to God and you should give your mind to God. Now, the truth is, we actually accept that that is a symbolic understanding of tefillin. We actually accept that. But we also understand that it refers to doing it, you see? So people make a mistake. People often characterize Karaitism and Sadducees as reading the Torah literally. That's not always true. They read the Torah without the benefit of Torah Shebaal Peh. But they will also interpret different things figuratively, poetically, metaphorically. Tefillin is a very good example. They bedafka gravitate to the non-literal interpretation of those psukim. You see, that's a very, very interesting point. Another example, they observe a holiday of Rosh Hashanah in the first day of the 7th month, which is Tishrei, but they don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. They have Rosh Hashanah without a shofar blowing. Why is that so? Well, if I were to ask you, show me where the Torah says you're supposed to blow a shofar on Rosh Hashanah. It really doesn't say it. The Torah says in Parsha, in fact, you're going to read this next week, a week from Shabbos, Parsha Emor. Yom Teruah Yiyeh Lachem. Rosh Hashanah is a day of Teruah. Now, Teruah can mean shouting, it can mean blowing, it can mean praying, it can be rejoicing. The word Teruah itself does not carry with it the meaning of shofar. How do we know Teruah means blowing shofar? The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, because we make a gezerah shava. It says by Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, and it says on the Jubilee year that you inaugurate the year of Yovel, V'havartem shofar teruah. You shall blow a shofar. So Chazal make it gezerah shava, just like where it says Teruah by Yovel. It means shofar. Rosh Hashanah, where it says Teruah, it means shofar. Gezerah shava, one of the Yud Gimel Mitais. Shatayra nidreshes bahem. The Tzdukim don't accept the Yud Gimel Midas. Shatayra nidreshes bahem. I don't think they keep the Jubilee year, I'm not sure. But according to them, you would blow the shofar for the Jubilee year, but you would not blow it on Rosh Hashanah. Yeah?
That sounds really silly, but how do we know that we're right and they're wrong? How does that come into play?
Well, that's obviously going to be a very, very fundamental question. But once again, historically, I think it's fairly simple, because if I can date the Karaite movement to around 980, or I don't have the exact date, then obviously this was a newly created movement that was contravening and contradicting the Masorah that Klal Yisrael already had. Like people ask, how do you know Orthodoxy is right over the Reform movement? Well, one answer is simply because the Reform movement was invented, in the beginning of the 19th century. And presumably even they don't claim that God spoke to them. Right? They may not believe in God, so they don't claim there was some revelation.
Same thing with the Sadducees? When was that movement?
Yeah, so once again, the Tzdukim arose really around Antiochus' time, meaning it was connected to Hellenism. It's again, technically, you may be wondering, because it's not intuitive immediately, what is the connection between Hellenism and Sadducees? Hellenism was assimilation and going with Greek culture. Sadducees is reading the Torah literally. They don't automatically kind of connect with each other. But in a sense, they do, because once you divorce the written Torah from the oral law, it is then open to many, many, many interpretations, including subjective ones. So essentially, Sadducees, now the Karaites were a little firmer in that way, but Sadducees kind of created their own religion. Yeah.
How do we know what's meant to be taken
Well, it's a good question. This is part of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh tells you sometimes things are meant to be symbolical, metaphorical. Often, both levels are true at the same time. Tefillin is actually a perfect example. Tefillin is taken literally, but the symbolic meaning is also emes, right? I think we spoke about this. Part of the reason why we tie something to our arms is we're giving our strength to Hashem. And I put the tefillin on my head because I'm giving my mind to Hashem. So the symbolic meaning that the Karaites put into the mitzvah, we actually accept that symbolic meaning, but we say it has to be augmented by a physical action and the like. So the point I'm making is this was a long digression, but again, it's good to know about this, is simply that one of the major controversies in the Tzdukim and the Chachamim, which carries over to the Karaites, is the meaning of Mimacharas HaShabbos in the pasuk of the Omer. Is it Sunday, the day after Saturday, or is it the second day of Pesach? Obviously, we paskin, it is the second day of Pesach. I'll discuss later why does the Torah use the word Shabbos, if indeed it means the second day of Pesach. So someone had a hand up? Yeah.
In general, are Karaites today politically Jewish?
So this is very important. So the answer is there are Karaim even today. Sometimes, in a few places, they have their own synagogues. Okay, a lot of times they will be integrated in the regular Jewish community. Right? You can have. In fact, I've spoken to rabbis. I've gotten shiloh sometimes about this Karaite couple wants to make a bar mitzvah for their. Where do they get bar mitzvah? I'm not sure. But the Karaite couple wants to make a bar mitzvah for their child in our shul. Are we allowed to make a bar mitzvah for them, and the like? So the emes is this. The emes is that this is a big machlokus. There are some poskim who take the position that you have to regard Karaites as halachically not even Jewish, because there may have been intermarriage, they may have accepted converts who did not meet halachic standards, and the like, and therefore you treat them as the chazak of Einam Yehudim. On the other hand, Rav Avadya Yosef has a very, very interesting tshuva. Rav Avadya Yosef, he was born in Eretz Yisrael. In fact, he was born across the street. He was born in the Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood. But in his younger years, his first rabbinical position, he was a Rav in Egypt. So he lived in Mitzrayim for a few years. And Mitzrayim at the time, this goes back, I guess, to the 1920s, Mitzrayim at the time had a very, very large Karaite population. A very large Karaite population. And he writes, he knew the Karaites very, very well. And although they were wrong and everything they were doing was keneged the Torah, but they were 100% Jewish. And they are B'cheskas Yisrael. And Rav Avadya Paskin, that you can even, counting them per minyan would be a different shiloh because they're kofrim b'Torah, but whatever it would be, they are halachically Jewish. So it seems that by and large we do treat Karaites as the same as we would treat any non-religious Jew. They're Jews who are not following halacha properly, but we treat them as Jews. Now here, by the way, the Rambam has a very famous ruling. The Rambam himself was confronted with Karaites. Remember, where did the Rambam live? The Rambam lived in Egypt, and that's where the largest concentration of Karaites were. And the Rambam has a famous ruling where the Rambam differentiates between the first generation of Karaites who rejected the Torah and their children and later generations who were raised. And he talks about the idea that the first generation are called Apikorsim and Kofrim and Rishayim, and we have to treat them with distance. The next generation were born into it, so they have the status of babies who were kidnapped, Tinok Shenishba, and therefore we have to deal with them in a loving, compassionate, good manner. Now, that Rambam, which is written about the Karaim, is exactly the way we relate to Reform Jews or non-observant Jews. And that is, by and large, if they were born into that, and didn't have the education. So even though they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, but nevertheless, we don't treat them, God forbid, as Rishayim or evildoers, because they were simply raised a certain way, and therefore they're not completely responsible. So all of this is based on the Rambam's Yesod with respect to the Karaites. That whole Yesod of Tinok Shenishba, based on your upbringing and your environment, is derived from the Rambam's famous ruling regarding the later generations of Karaites. Of course, the Rambam, in a way, had to fight all sorts of... we look at the Rambam, we think of him in terms of his Svarim. That's his legacy. But he had a tough time in Cairo. He was fighting the Karaites on one side, and he was fighting another group. There were people from Eretz Yisrael who established their own minyanim, and they wanted to continue the old minhagim of Eretz Yisrael, including reading the Torah on a 3-year cycle. Do you remember this? The Gemara tells us that the original minhag of Eretz Yisrael is they didn't finish the Torah every year. They finished the Torah every 3 years. And Bavel, the minhag was every year. What the 3-year cycle was is a very, it's not so pashut. People try to reconstruct it and the like. It may have been a 3.5-year cycle, so they finished the Torah twice in 7 years. Okay, and again, there's a whole speculation, how do you reconstruct it? But be it as it may, it was very, very clear that that was already kind of a dead minhag already by the time of the Amoraim in the Talmud Bavli. And yet, the Rambam was faced with a minion of people who wanted to do that old-fashioned minhag, and the Rambam had to work very hard to be mevatel. Yeah.
Did Sadducees and Karaites also accept Navi and Kesuvim?
Yes, they do. Now, what's interesting is this. I'm going to talk more about the Karaites than the Tzdukim, because the Tzdukim are kind of gone. But the Karaites continue to exist, and they exist at Hayom Hazeh. Yeah.
Do we know how the Karaite movement started? How did somebody decide that we're going to stop putting on tefillin?
That's a little difficult because it's quite literally one man started it, right? So it's an interesting point. I mean, Anan Ben David. You can Google his name and get a Wikipedia article on him. How does one man? Well, again, I guess we have the same problem with Yashka, although maybe they're a little more complicated. Mohammed, for sure, one guy started something. It's a little hard to know how do you get followers that way, but apparently. Things do have traction, although again, the Karaites never became a massive movement, other than in Egypt, there was a large concentration. Yeah?
We say there's, I don't know if it's 70 faces to the Torah, or like interpretation-wise, we say
Yeah.
there's multiple ways to interpret something from the Torah.
Yeah.
So how do we determine whose interpretation is correct? Like what makes one rabbi's interpretation any less correct than the next rabbi?
Well, again, if you're talking about rabbis, like who says Rabbi Yashiv is better than Rav Shlomo Zalman, or vice versa, the short answer is, yeah, who says? Maybe they're all equally valid. But when you're talking about people who deny the oral law totally, then they're chutz l'machaneh. They're not within the parameters of what is called legitimate interpretation. There are 70 interpretations within a certain framework of belief, but if you reject the fundamental beliefs of Torah Shebaal Peh, then you don't count. Basically,
So regarding the physical action of putting on tefillin, that's explicit in oral Torah, we're saying?
Yes, it is. Chazal say it is a halacha. It's not explicit in the written Torah, but it's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It was conveyed to Moshe, going all the way back from Har Sinai.
So the Karaites don't believe in
They don't believe in that.
They only believe in
That's correct. They only even Torah Shabbat. Yeah.
Well, will we group Sabbateans in the same group as Karaites?
Well, who I didn't hear you.
Sabbateans?
No, Sabbateans is really a very, very different issue. I mean, some of them may have, there were Karaites who joined it. Sabbateans were simply people who believed that this guy Shabtai Tzvi was Mashiach. Now, he attracted a lot of people. He attracted from Jews who made a mistake, who were fully from, they were Shomer Shabbos. Some say, even Rav Yonasan Eibshitz, who was one of the great Gedolei Hador, was a secret Sabbatean. I don't want to get into that. Maybe I shouldn't even have said it, but and the like. And then there were people who were Karaim, and there were people who converted to Christianity. So Sabbatean is a separate issue. Those are the people who followed Shabtai Tzvi and later Jacob Frank, and they could be anybody. They could be an entire range of different types of people. Yeah.
Rebbe said that in Yerushalayim there's a minhag to finish the Torah every 3 years, and it's in the Gemara and the Yerushalmi Gemara.
Yeah.
What gives us the right to let a minhag die? If it's a real minhag that's standing on some sort of ground.
Yeah, it's a very excellent question. In fact, it's not only mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi, it is mentioned in the Talmud Bavli. The Talmud Bavli mentions that the minhag of Eretz Yisrael was to read the Torah in a 3-year cycle. The minhag of Bavel was to read the Torah in a 1-year cycle, and the halacha is like the minhag of Bavel. But of course, where does it say the halacha is like the minhag of Bavel? In the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud. So you're raising a very, very good question, meaning this is a bit of a complex period. One of the things the Gaonim of Bavel did, this is after the Gemara, is they established the supremacy of the Babylonian Talmud over the Jerusalem Talmud. And as a result, there were minhagim that are in the Talmud Yerushalmi that were simply extinguished by virtue of the acceptance of Talmud Bavli as being the higher compilation. How that occurred is a very, very excellent question. I mean, if one were to be cynical, which I'm not, and I hope you're not, I mean, it almost looks like a conflict of interest. I mean, the Gaonim of Bavel are the ones who assert that it's like, I'll give you a similar parallel question. This irritates me a lot. People always ask the question, if I'm Ashkenazi, can I change to Sephardi? Or if I'm Sephardi, can I change to Ashkenazi? So here is what you find. If you look at the Sephardic poskim, they say, oh sure, an Ashkenazi can certainly change to Sephardi, but a Sephardi cannot change to an Ashkenazi. You look at the Ashkenazi poskim, and they say, oh sure, a Sephardi could change to an Ashkenazi, but an Ashkenazi cannot change to a Sephardi. So, I mean, these are chashuva people, but as a matter of practical guidance, to me, that's almost a worthless type of guidance. Meaning, the Ashkenazi rabbi will say, you can always be Ashkenaz, and the Sephardi rabbi will say, you can always be Sephardi. So, what am I supposed to do? So, in a sense, you have a similar problem here, where it was the Gaonim of Bavel that decreed that the Yerushalmi minhagim will no longer be binding. It's a very, very good question, and sometimes it was a very difficult process. The Babylonian Talmud was not accepted in one day. You have to understand. This new Talmud comes out, that's recording debates over hundreds of years, and it contradicts existing minhagim that existed in Eretz Yisrael for hundreds and hundreds of years. People were resistant to give things up. And even in the Rambam's time, which was hundreds of years after the Babylonian Talmud, those minhagei Eretz Yisrael survived. By the way, Rabbeinu Tam actually writes that there are certain aspects of Nusach Ashkenaz that are connected the Babylonian Talmud, and they're based on the Yerushalmi. So it's interesting that in spite of the supremacy of the Babylonian Talmud, there are certain aspects in our liturgy. In fact, it's been said that Sephardic Nusach is closer to the Nusach of the Babylonian Talmud, and Ashkenazic Nusach is actually connected to the older Nusach of Eretz Yisrael. So there's no consistency here, meaning, as a general rule, the Bavli trumps the Yerushalmi, but there are going to be exceptions into that. Yeah?
Based on what Rob said, that it took a long time for the Talmud Bavli to be
accepted.
by the
Yes.
people, and being that we say that the Talmud Bavli is the Torah Shabbat Pei that was handed down to Moshe Messina, wouldn't this be a good argument that the Karaites could use that, look, you guys say that this is the old Torah, but it wasn't even accepted by the entire Jewish people at the time, it contradicts the Yerushalmi in some places.
Yeah, the Karaites could use it, and the Karaites did use it. Indeed, they pointed to that. But again, one has to understand something. I mean, one needs to put this in perspective. Both the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud do have this common Messiah of Torah Shabbat Peh, meaning, except there are many machloksim, just like in the Gemara itself, there are many machloksim. So there are machloksim, but they are working within the same framework. They have the same Mishnah, right? The Yerushalmi and the Bavli is the same Mishnah, right? So it's important not to look at Bavli versus Yerushalmi as Prushim versus Saddukim. It's not that way at all. The Bavli and the Yerushalmi are both operating within the framework of Torah Shabbal Peh. Yeah.
So we said the Yerushalmi was started first.
Yeah.
So why did Bavli seem to need to make their own? If they already had this existing one, did they
Yeah.
not see that it was fit?
Yeah, so the standard answer that is given is that the Yerushalmi was written under conditions of extreme persecutions. At that time, Christianity had already become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and Jewish settlements were decimated, people were being murdered. The conditions were not conducive for the full development of ideas, as opposed to Bavel, where the conditions were much better. And as a result, that even explains why the style of the Yerushalmi is very terse, very incomplete. And therefore, the argument was that the Babylonian Talmud represented a fuller, more developed discussion of halacha. And that's why the Gaonim gave us the rule that in a machlokas, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, we follow the Bavli. Now, yeah.
I was going to say, I heard the other argument that the greater sages of Klal Yisrael were in Babel instead of Yerushalayim, but I suppose that it's like the same argument as like, oh, well, we're the greater sages in Babel and suppose Yerushalayim, so we shouldn't have the halacha be like that.
Yeah, but part of it was you have to recognize that the persecutions in Eretz Yisrael under the Byzantines were very, very, very extreme. Bavel was not under a Christian. Bavel was under Zoroastrianism and the like, which were pretty bad too. But they kind of, as long as you didn't light fires at night, you were okay. Whatever, they had things that they were fire. They didn't allow fire at night or whatever it is. But they let the Jews do their studying. So anyway, I want to point out though that because the Karaites did not believe in Gemara or Chazal, so they spent most of their kochos on biblical scholarship and diktuk. So as a result, many Karaites became very, very, very proficient in Tanakh and in diktuk, ad kedei kach, that sometimes we have meforshim, our meforshim, that will use the interpretations of Karaim, not on matters of religion or philosophy, but in terms of the meaning of a word, the shorish of a word, exactly. So if you look at the Ibn Ezra will sometimes quote Karaite interpretations, although he'll often differ with them. Barbanel quotes Karaim and the like. And indeed, one of the most important books, which is a polemic against Christianity, right? As you know, one of the techniques of Christian missionaries is to take various psukim in Nach, primarily from the book of Yeshayahu, but from other books as well, and try to use them as proof for Jesus and the like. And most B'nai Yeshiva don't even, never even learn those psukim, right? So a missionary goes over to you and says, "So what do you do with Isaiah 53? Huh? What do you do about that?" And you're trying to go through, what on earth is Isaiah 53? What is that? And the like. And they try to make a convincing case, or even the statement that, "Behold, a child will be conceived by a virgin." Right? Prediction of virgin birth. But the problem is, of course, that the word for virgin is besula, but it doesn't say besula in the pasuk. It says alma. Alma is a term that just means a young woman. It does not connote virgin or not, right? So different things like that. So one of the most effective books that goes through each of the Christian proofs that they derive from Tanakh is a book written by a Karaite. It's called Chizuk Emunah, Strengthening of Faith. It's available in English even. It's an old book. It's around, it's almost 200 years old, I think now. and you can still get it, and was written by a Karaite because he goes through all the psukim. He doesn't, see, you understand why a Karaite in some ways has more credibility here. Because let's say a Christian tells you something, and you say, well, that's not emes because we have a medrash that says this, or a Gemara that says this. He says, well, so what? I don't believe in medrash. I don't believe in Gemara. See, by definition, you can't have, you can't really use Gemaras against people who don't accept Gemara as an authority. But the Karaites didn't use Gemara. They didn't use Medrash. The Karaites used the biblical text. They used the grammar. They used the syntax of the sentence. Now, those were things that the Christians accepted. The Christians accepted the sanctity of even the Old Testament text. So in a sense, just like I say, that the best refutation of evolution is by David Berlinski, who's an atheist, right? Because when you have religious people who try to refute evolution, whether it's a Christian or a Jew, you have your biases, you're defending religion. Here you have a guy who doesn't believe in God, who says evolution doesn't make sense. That has a lot of credibility, because here you have a guy who is not standing up for religion, but he's showing scientifically evolution has a lot of holes. So the same thing, too, if you want to refute Christianity, a Karaite is kind of your best guy to do it, because he is only using the sources that the other side would agree to as well. So I remember I was once in Harvard University Library, the Widener Library, which is one of the biggest libraries in the world, and they have a huge section of Jewish svarim. Sometimes it's such a chaval, Chazal say, everything needs mazel, even a Sefer Torah. I mean, you wonder, what's the chus? Some shasin are zocha to be in a yeshiva beis medrash, where they get used all the time, and others are going to be in Harvard University Library or Johns Hopkins or whatever it is, where maybe, once in 500 years, somebody's going to pick it up. It's a chaval. Why does one Gemara get to be in one place and another Gemara gets to be in another place? It's very sad. I feel sorry for the Sfarim. But in this section, there was a section of Karaite literature, including the Karaite prayer book. So I was very curious. What would a Karaite siddur look like? Right? They're not going to have a Shemona Esrei, because the Shemona Esrei was written by the Anshe Knesset HaGdola. They're not going to have Birchas Kriya Shema. Right? Again, Anshe Knesset HaGdola. So what's their siddur? Their siddur is a big siddur. It's as big as any siddur. So I opened it up. So it's very interesting. They have a lot of Tehillim, like Psukei de Zimra, although not necessarily the same ones. And they have the Shema. And then they have prayers of their own composition. So it's interesting. This shows you something. People sometimes say, the definition of a Karaite is we only go with what the written Torah says. We don't offer any interpretations or anything in addition. That's not possible. Everything has to be interpreted. So to say we don't do interpretation, that makes no sense at all. Elamai, we do our interpretation, not your interpretation. So they write their own prayers. It's not like we only say what's in the Tanakh. They wrote their own poems, their own prayers, their own meditations, and the like. So the notion that you can create a religion without the need to interpret a written text is bichlal a false illusion. There is no such thing as not having interpretation. Words have to be interpreted. All language has to be interpreted. Yeah.
They still believe in Mashiach, and they have
do they believe in Mashiach? I have to see. I have to see this. I have to go check. There is a website. You can check Karaites at our website, and they tell you what they believe in. I don't think they believe in Mashiach ben David, for sure not. But they do believe in an afterworld. They do believe in a world to come. Yeah.
Is it true that they were the ones that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No. Okay. So this is also confusing. The Bayit Sheni, well, it wouldn't be the Quran, but maybe you mean the Tzdukim. The Quran weren't invented until the 980s. The Dead Sea Scrolls date from the Second Temple period. So there would be Stukim would be around. But the Dead Sea Scroll people were different. They also rebelled against the oral law, but they were a different movement. The Dead Sea Scrolls were people who were like ascetics, hermits. They lived communally. They were very similar to what later would be called Christian monks, although they were not Christians, they were Jewish. So they were, again, heretical movements that rejected Chazal. So there were many movements that rejected Chazal, but they weren't necessarily working together.
Do we discredit the Dead Sea
Yes, we do. We consider the Dead Sea Scrolls to be the product of heretical movements.
Of heretical movements?
Heretical, yeah, Epicurus movements, yeah. Okay, so how did I get onto this? Oh, so again, all of this was just general material just to illustrate that Sfiras HaOmer was one of the major controversies between the Prushim and the Stukim. Okay, so next time we'll get back to Sfiras HaOmer and talk about a little bit, and then we'll segue back to Tomer Devorah. So take care. Yep.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.